Welcome to our podcast. This is the first of a four-part series. In this episode, we will shine light on the destructive human wrongs that are masqueraded as human rights. We will learn that some Western countries, along with international organizations, are truly undermining our human rights. So buckle up your seatbelt because we're in for a wild ride. A treaty is an agreement between sovereign states and may involve organizations like the United Nations. The UN has facilitated 9 core human rights treaties, which in turn have defined human rights. Here are 5 statements of human rights law.
The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. The social significance of maternity, motherhood, and the role of parents in the family and in the upbringing of children should be acknowledged. Maternity, motherhood, parenting, and the role of women in procreation must not be a basis for discrimination. The best interests of the child shall be the guiding principles of those responsible for his or her education and guidance. That responsibility lies in the first place with the parents. The primary responsibility for the protection, upbringing, and development of children rests with the family. The state parties to the present covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents, to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions.
Clearly, international treaties define human rights that protect children and parents. The UN is supposed to oversee implementation and compliance with human rights within countries that have agreed to a particular treaty. But what if the unthinkable happens? What if the UN becomes influenced by values at odds with fundamental human rights, and then begins to use mechanisms like expert opinions and global conferences, along with negotiated outcome documents, to evolve the law in ways that trample fundamental human rights? Sharon Slater is the president of Family Watch International. Sharon, can you tell us and give us insight in what your involvement has been working with the United Nations?
About 23 years ago, I was a stay-at-home mom, and I'd never been involved politically active, not even in the PTA, I'm embarrassed to say. But I got invited to go to United Nations conference, and I'd heard that the family was under attack, but that sounded really foreign to me. And they sent me into a room and told me to take notes on, what they were saying about the family. And I heard all these radical feminist views, and then all of a sudden someone raised their hand and they said, I think we should put a protection in here for religious freedom when the UN goes into war-torn countries. And you would have thought they dropped a bomb in the room. I mean, everyone was attacking her. And then all of a sudden I realized I had in my bag in the corner of the room the exact citations she needed to support her argument. So I started shaking. I didn't know what I could do or couldn't do. And I thought, I didn't know if they'd throw me out, but I went and I got it and I put it on the right page and I got behind her and I stuck it on her lap. And then all of a sudden she's in the middle of trying to argue her point. The whole room's against her. And she looks down and she has the very citations she needs to win this argument. She raises her hand, she reads them off, and the room was silent because all these nations had already agreed in other documents that they had to protect religious freedom. So she asked for a break and she pulled me out in the hallway and she said, "Who are you?" And the thing was, I was a mom, but I happened to be a mom in the right place at the right time with the right tool to impact international policies, and that changed my life because I thought if I could stumble in to UN negotiations and have that kind of an impact, what could we do if we brought in experts or we became experts and lawyers and moms and people in all the different fields and that they're making policies around. And so we founded Family Watch International, and it just grew, and we found a huge need where diplomats just needed help with arguments and what was happening really deceptively in many of these UN documents.
Susan Roylance is a founder of United Families International. She has been involved in dozens of United Nations conferences beginning in 1995. Susan, can you give us some insight into your experiences that you have had at the United Nations?
As I came into the UN, some of the people who knew me took my arm and said, "Come into this caucus and you'll learn more about the UN than any place else you go." So I went in with them into this caucus. It was called the Linkage Caucus. I introduced myself as Susan Roylance from United Families of America because I was the president of United Families of America at the time. But when I said United Families of America, the room broke out into laughter and jeers. It was a life-changing moment for me. I had no idea that Mean for Families would be such a negative thing. Finally it calmed down and I said, "Can I say something?" And Bella Abzug was the one who was the head of this caucus, and she was the one who had pushed all of the things I'd been concerned about clear back in 1977. I was surprised to see her here. And she said, "Yeah, you can say something." So I said, "I don't understand why you can't be for the advancement of women and families too. Why are the two mutually exclusive?" I came home and I stood in my house here in Murray, and I looked over at the mountains, the Wasatch Front, and I said, "I don't have to worry about this stuff. I live in a great place. We have a great legislature. You know, they're not perfect, but they're good. And my children are safe, da-da-da-da-da." And then I said to myself, if I, who have nothing to lose, don't do something, who can?
Bill Saunders is a Harvard Law School graduate. He is now a professor of human rights at the Catholic University of America. Bill, can you share with us some of the experiences that you have had at the United Nations?
I was privileged to serve on a delegation to the UN under President George W. Bush. It was the first delegation after he was elected president following President Clinton. Now this was a conference on children. It was called the World Summit on Children, and the document that had been drafted by a lot of people I assume who were kind of holdovers from the Clinton age, didn't mention the family. But we put it in we got it in the document. The first day we read that statement in the General Assembly, and the whole place went in an uproar, positive uproar, hoorah, you know, yippee. And these were a lot of people from Africa and Asia who were representing their country, and they were so thrilled to have a U.S. that was not pushing them to control their population.
Stefano Giannani is the Vice President of Legal Studies at CFAM. Stefano, what insights can you share with us relating to your experiences in addressing family policy worldwide?
There's the common misperception that UN resolutions are non-binding. In actual fact, they are binding. Even if they're not binding on states, they are in fact binding on the UN system, the UN agencies who implement the resolutions. Moreover, the resolutions can actually be used as evidence of customary international law. So, you know, for example, the term sexual and reproductive health has been in UN resolutions for over 2 decades now. And it's been implemented by the UN system as including a right to abortion. And unless UN member states actively object to this interpretation of UN resolutions, in actual fact what's happening is over time they are creating a customary international right to these issues through policies involving sexual and reproductive health in UN resolutions.
But what I did learn is that there are many good delegates from various countries. They don't come to promote any agenda of the United Nations. They come to do what they think is good for the world. And sometimes they just don't know what to do. Their motives are good, but they don't understand the language, or they don't understand what they can do.
Sometimes we think the UN doesn't matter. You think oh, this is a bunch of stupid, silly stuff. It's not. It's dangerous. When you combine activist courts with these kind of crazy assemblies that issue crazy statements, our own liberty can be, our own freedom, our own lives and families can be at risk.
If you can get enough governments or entities or elements within the EU to say that something is a right, enough times and enough reports and enough ways, and nations don't oppose it, they can actually become bound by these issues as if it were binding law.
You know, you have this term, sexual and reproductive health, which seems benevolent, innocuous. It seems to be talking about maternal health, ultimately. But in reality, behind that terminology, there is an entire agenda of promoting sexual autonomy for children, and so it's very controversial.
Well, the reason we care about this language is because it does govern the actions of the United Nations and the things they expect from countries who are a part of the United Nations. There's 195, I think, countries who are signed on to be a part of the United Nations. And these documents can be used to require the countries to do certain things. Now, some are more, a treaty is stronger than a conference outcome document. But the Beijing Conference, Fourth World Conference on Women, is very strong. And although it's not a treaty, it has things written into it that have been implemented that have required countries to do certain things. And, you know, the IMF and the World Bank are very strong sources. Countries borrow money from those two sources, or they receive money. And if they're not in compliance, then they don't get the money.
In the UN negotiations, they're pushing these same things again and again, almost every UN negotiation. In fact, there's UN negotiations going on as we speak. There'll be another UN negotiation at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And I can guarantee you, I can predict, I would bet my life that the fight that will be in this document will be on sexual and reproductive health and comprehensive sexuality education, because it's proposed no matter what the issue.
Danelia, what have you seen at these international conferences that you have attended?
We were at the OAS, which is the Organization of American States Summit in Lima in Peru, which is a country that is going through a lot, like all Latin American countries. And in the draft that they were discussing, it was like a 35 page draft. You know, the word poverty was mentioned, if I remember, 1 or 5 times. And terms like comprehensive sexual education, abortion, and all that was mentioned 35, 40 times. And you know what frustrated me? I was angry. I was really angry when I was there, because I saw all these people. It's literally taking place in Lima, Peru, meters away from poverty, because even the headquarters was like meters away from poverty that I personally have suffered in my own life, in my own family, you know. And all that they care is talking about some abortion agenda and some contraceptive agenda in Latin America. Like in Latin America, I'm like, are you kidding me? That's infuriating when you think about it, how disconnected they are from reality.
Today, the sexual rights agenda has become elevated over a country's basic needs.
They'll say that comprehensive sexuality education will prevent teen pregnancy, will prevent STDs, will stop domestic violence, will help with climate change, will, you know, lift people out of poverty. There is no end to the claims they will make about this, but they never show the governments the manuals, like what's inside. And that's the problem. So governments start to adopt these policies.
Peter Sprigg has worked at the Heritage Foundation and is now working for Family Watch International. Peter, what can your research tell us about these sexual reproductive health rights that are being advanced today?
Although they use this term sexual and reproductive health and rights, actually the issue of health is downplayed. It's not central to the agenda. And the issue of reproduction is not central to the agenda. It's the first and last word, the first and last letters of that acronym that are central, which is sexual rights. And I think this is a modern development. 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, no one would have put the terms sexual and rights together. any discussion of human sexuality would not have taken place within the context of rights.
You have, for example, the sexuality education standards in Europe, and this is published by the World Health Organization. And if you can imagine, it teaches children as young as 0 to 4. It recommends teaching them to touch their body parts for sexual pleasure. At 9, children are supposed to learn about orgasm and how to get sexual pleasure. But what I find most unconscionable is at age 9, they also send children to International Planned Parenthood Federation to learn about their sexual rights. That's IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Federation. And do you know what they'll learn there? Well, the Healthy, Happy, and Hot brochure that's funded by them, that I picked up at the United Nations, teaches children that have the HIV virus, they're infected with HIV, that they can have sexual pleasure, how to get sexual pleasure in all different ways. And what's more unconscionable is that they don't have to tell their sexual partners they are infected with HIV. And if you go to their sexual rights document, which children would go to, where the UN would be sending them to learn about sexual rights, it actually says that children should be having different forms of sexual pleasure, and if they're, that this is good for their health and well-being. Children, if you can imagine.
If some of these issues were addressed individually and upfront, just on the face of it, like, do you want to legalize abortion at every stage of pregnancy? The countries would say, no, we're against that. Our people are against that. We're not going to do that. Or, do you want to teach your children in schools that everyone has an absolute right to express their sexuality at any age, including in childhood? They would say, no, absolutely not. We don't want that. We don't believe in that. We're not going to accept that.
And what they do is they say, we're going to teach your children about how to stand for your values. So they get the children in and they say, okay, where do your values come from? Well, they're your parents, your religion. And then they'll tell them things like, well, but some parents think masturbation is good for their children. Others think it isn't. Some people think it's okay for children to have sex. Some religions, are okay with that. Some aren't. What they do is they teach I call it sexual relativism. Then they say, well, do you know what? You don't have to have the same values as your parents. You can separate. You have your own values that you need to stand by. And by the way, there's international values that everybody agrees to. They're called human rights. And as part of human rights, you have sexual and reproductive health and rights. And part of those, there's sexual rights. And if you want to realize your sexual rights, you've got to have sexual knowledge. I mean, how can you realize these rights if you don't have sexual knowledge on all these things? Then they bring in that radical comprehensive sexuality education.
They conceal that agenda within, within the language, and they lump all these issues together, so it's kind of a take it or leave it. It's a package deal, rather than asking these countries to accept one by one all of the implications.
In the beginning, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created by the United Nations. It was a couple years later after the Charter. It's the oldest, and it is the most accepted document in the world. It's very, very, very good. And it has wonderful language about the family. It has wonderful language about marriage. It has wonderful language about parents being responsible for the education of their children. It's just an amazing document. And it's one of the reasons why we have other good documents that coalesce underneath that basic document that was created so wonderfully. And so there are good documents. And that's why we were able to do these books. There's good documents that say good things, but it would be really easy not to know that if nobody pointed it out to you, because there's so much pushing in the other direction.
First of all, it's so bizarre that people have a really hard time believing it's even happening. And so we spend a lot of our time finding the evidence and showing it. And I could show you a publication. It's called Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights for Asia Pacific Youth. And it's got UNICEF's logo on it. And you know what it actually says? It says, sexting is the sending or receiving of nude pictures and videos. and that doing this with your friends is helpful. It can help raise your self-esteem. It can help you develop your sexual identity. They're actually encouraging children to sex, if you can imagine. They even go to, well, the sexual knowledge you need to have to be able to realize sexual rights is you need to know all the sexual patterns. And it lists voyeurism, exhibitionism, pederasty, bestiality, necrophilia, urophilia, and it goes on. And they ask the children to, study this list and choose the two they're going to share with the classroom. I mean, what possible good could possibly come from putting any of these ideas in a child's head? This is sexual abuse, and yet you have all these UN agencies funded by the European Commission pushing this on children, especially in developing countries.
What I believe is happening is that they are using this terminology of rights as a way of trying to impose an ideology and saying, instead of saying, we have a certain set of beliefs and we want you to share our set of beliefs, and trying to persuade people, they're saying, oh, these are rights. And things that are rights, that are human rights, they just exist and you must acknowledge them, you must accept them. If you don't accept them and don't respect them and don't abide by them, you are a bad person. That's really what we're battling against, is this agenda which has co-opted the language of rights in order to impose an ideology about sexuality.
Sharon, have these sexual and educational concepts become human rights? Because this UN publication makes it sound like they are.
There is no treaty that deals with abortion. There is no treaty that deals with comprehensive sexuality education. There is no human treaty that mentions any of these things. So they have to go around and pretend that these human rights include these things by manipulating the treaty bodies to make pronouncements that they do, by getting their friends who are UN experts in these high places arbitrating and announcing and expounding on what are human rights. And it's all deception. It's all deception.
Again, what is the significance of a treaty in human rights? A treaty is an agreement between sovereign states and may involve organizations like the United Nations. They are the foundation of international law, and they contain over 100 statements that strongly support the rights of children, parents, and religion. Here again are a few examples.
The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. The social significance of maternity, motherhood, and the role of parents in the family and in the upbringing of children should be acknowledged. Maternity, motherhood, parenting, and the role of women in procreation must not be a basis for discrimination. The best interests of the child shall be the guiding principles of those responsible for his or her education and guidance. That responsibility lies in the first place with the parents. The primary responsibility for the protection, upbringing, and development of children rests with the family. The state parties to the present covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents, to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions.
Clearly, international treaties define human rights that protect children and parents. But ironically, we have seen that human wrongs are being masqueraded as human rights. And that the United Nations, which was originally formed to protect human rights, is now being used to undermine them. This concludes episode 1, which gives you hopefully new insight as needed to stand for the family. In the next episode 2, we will learn why the United Nations and other international organizations are working to undermine the rights of children, parents, marriage, faith, and family in society today.